And now for the second half of this presentation, I'll take over. My name is James McMicken, and the first thing we'll be covering is purposeful portfolios. So there are three main purposes for which we might use portfolios. The first purpose would be the documentation of student progress. Often when we're implementing this type of portfolio assessment, we would call this a working portfolio. And it's a working portfolio because we're actually collecting evidence of student growth, or unfortunately lack thereof. What we want to see is early evidence of work with subsequent examples of work, and we're hoping to see some sort of growth between the beginning and the end. It's really useful because this also gives students the chance to engage in meaningful self-evaluation, which is something they don't always get to do on a test. In a test, the student takes the test, and a teacher provides all the evaluation, and the student really doesn't get a chance to reflect on their performance until they get that back. Here, students can actually look at their improvement as they work through the portfolio, and it gives them a little bit more ownership of the situation, but also time to reflect on their performance as they progress. So the second type of portfolio would focus on showcasing student accomplishments. So here, rather than looking at the progress of growth, we're actually going to look at the outcome of growth. And so here, we're going to select the best work. And actually, in this case, we're going to let students select the best example as a celebration of their achievement. And this works really well for early grades. And again, because students are engaging in this process of choosing their own work and reflecting on it, this allows students to learn better because they're more involved, they're more engaged with the work, they have more ownership of it, so there's a little bit more buy-in. But it also provides the teacher with more insight into how the students learn. Some of the suggestions for implementing showcase portfolios would be to include a letter of introduction to possible reviewers, a table of contents just to keep everything organized, lists of skills and knowledge demonstrated. So for us at the secondary level, we might want to use standards in there, or just learning outcomes, a representative sample of best work, dates all entries, again helping to keep things organized. And again, if we see the dates, we can show that there is a general progression towards improvement and mastery. Evaluative criteria or a rubric, so we could show how we're actually going to assess this material, and the student self-reflection on all entries, so we could actually see how the student feels about the work they have done. So the final purpose that we might use would be to evaluate students with regard to their current status. So in this case, this is a much more teacher-focused form of assessment. We're trying to figure out if students have performed enough work or enough quality work to reach the certain levels that have already been established by a teacher. There's a little bit more standardization here, and because of this, the teachers actually make the selections based on the quality of the student's work. So there's a little bit less ownership on the student's part, and there's also less opportunities for students to perform self-evaluation unless the teacher actually asks the student to do this. But again, because of the standardization, we're going to want to use rubrics more so for students to actually make sure they are creating work that meets the standards that we have established. So the question is, could you create one great portfolio that would achieve all these purposes? The reality is probably not, because we're going to try to create a portfolio that meets one of these purposes. You essentially want to focus on one thing at a time. So if we really want to focus on student growth, we want to focus on the working portfolio. If we want to showcase the end goal that a student selects, we're going to look at a showcasing format. But if we want to look at the one that's going to show mastery of a specific standard and we're going to evaluate it, then we're going to look at the third option, which is going to be an evaluation of the student's status. If you try to implement too many of these things, the realities are probably not going to get great results. Again, we want to make inferences based on the data we collect, and if the data we collect is all over the place, then unfortunately our inferences are going to be all over the place. So as we're looking at the work samples that we want to collect, thinking divergently about what should be included, this just means look at a wide range of samples. However, you don't want to have just too much in there. You don't want to have too much variety. We do want to show a central tendency here as far as if we're looking at growth, we want to have examples that actually demonstrate that a student is progressing over time. And so here we want to look at things that actually serve that purpose. We don't just want to throw in various types of activities to illustrate how many different types of learning activities we had for students, because it makes us look better. We want to really focus on what the student was able to do and select work based on that purpose. So again, in doing that, if we are looking at the best samples that students have, then we can actually make valid inferences about the student's skills and knowledge. And again, this is where we really want to limit what we are selecting based on the purposes that we have established at the outset. And again, just because this is an alternative type of assessment, it doesn't mean we get away from the concepts of validity, reliability, and fairness. These are all concepts that we still need to apply. Just because we're not taking or developing a standardized test or an in-class multiple choice test or something like that, we still need to make sure that the material we are providing for our students to assess their learning is valid, reliable, and fair. Otherwise, the inferences we make will not be valid, reliable, or fair. Okay, so now the question is, how do we appraise a portfolio? So obviously, to create a standard way of grading, we're going to use a rubric. We want to evaluate the criteria carefully. So again, we're selecting material that's going to satisfy that purpose we established at the beginning. Again, just like with anything, we want to make sure students are not confused about what they're being asked to do. And effective portfolios will contribute to your inferences about students' knowledge of skills. So again, this goes back to our questions of reliability, validity, and fairness. If we haven't met those criteria, then reality is that we have not created an effective portfolio. And therefore, it's really not going to help us make proper inferences about students' knowledge or skills. And again, if we are not satisfying that purpose, then we shouldn't be using this portfolio. Okay, and now some of the pros of portfolio assessment. One of the good things is that we could tailor our portfolios to the individual needs, abilities, and interests of students. This allows us to kind of break the mold of always just using written tests to assess how well students understand something. This gives them the opportunity to not only produce their own artifacts, but allows them to engage in the process of also evaluating their own work to determine, are they progressing, or are there things that they still need to work on. And so again, this goes along with this idea that in collecting material and having them evaluate it, we're actually also instilling a growth mindset in our students. So if they are progressing, then they should see that, even though they might have struggled initially with determination and practice, they've actually improved, and this might be something they can transfer to other aspects of their life. The same could be said for self-evaluation and personal ownership. With self-evaluation, the ability to reflect on your own skills and abilities is something that's going to transfer not only to schoolwork, but also to career later on, and even relationships. The ability to evaluate how you're interacting with others is a huge skill that students need to develop, as well as the idea of personal ownership. So oftentimes with school, students might feel like, the things they do are always being given down by the teacher. They're always being evaluated by somebody else. But if we're really promoting this idea of ownership, then students take a little bit more responsibility for their education, and there's a little bit more buy-in, and therefore their motivation to learn should also increase. However, there are cons to portfolio assessment. It's not as easy or quick as offering just a quick multiple choice test. And because of this, we might not feel confident in implementing a portfolio assessment without sufficient training. And it can also be difficult to evaluate because if we're selecting various forms of assessment from each student, we're not going to have a uniform portfolio at the end, unless, again, this is possibly something that falls into the line of the evaluation of student status where the teacher selects the materials. There's a good possibility that the portfolio that one student turns in is not going to be the same as the portfolio that another student turns in. So therefore, the scoring guides we use can be useful, but they're going to be kind of general because, again, if I can't assess or if I can't establish what things are going to go in this portfolio from the beginning, I'm going to have to get comfortable with the idea that I'm going to have, various assignments representing one student's achievement level versus another's. So what do we need to know? Again, they're just a collection of students' work. It's not collected, randomly. We do have a purpose in which, that we apply when we're collecting data. It works really well in the classroom, at the classroom level, but as far as a large-scale initiative, it hasn't been quite as effective. It reflects the broader curricular aims rather than specific ones. And also, it needs to be an essential part of the learning experience and not just a tangential aspect. Again, this idea of students consistently reflecting on their work, consistently evaluating how they're doing, and really looking at whether or not they're growing is not something that can come to every now and then. It really needs to be an integral part of the experience. And again, if they're able to do this, we could really promote this idea of a growth mindset and the idea that hard work and practice can pay off. So again, we covered these key ingredients earlier, but again, they would be to establish student ownership. We need to decide which samples we're going to collect, and that is based on the purpose that we establish. We obviously need to collect that work. We're going to evaluate it using established criteria. We're going to require students to continuously evaluate what they've done. We're going to have conferences to check in just to make sure they're not confused about anything, but also to point out, their success and maybe areas of improvement. And we're going to involve parents in the process so that way they can also help monitor their students' progress as they go. So again, these are just the purposes we established earlier. Documenting of student progress would be used for a working portfolio. Showcasing student accomplishments would be for a showcase portfolio. And evaluating the student status, that's going to be, we're just trying to make sure students have actually hit a criteria that we have established as the teacher. There are many worthwhile reasons to consider portfolio assessment, but again, they are time-consuming. So here's some questions for you to consider. For your content area, what would a student portfolio look like? What kinds of artifacts would you collect? And second, if you're interested in implementing a portfolio assessment, why would you want to do this, or why wouldn't you want to do this? So again, think about it. Would it be a good option for students as an alternative? Would it be worth the time and effort it takes to do this? These are some things to consider. Also, if you'd like, here's a link at the top to the Vermont Portfolio Assessment Program, which is mentioned in the chapter. But also the second website is the Auburn University ePortfolio Project. If you check this out, they have some tips on how to actually develop e-portfolios, which are essentially student websites, and there are some examples on there as well that students have created to showcase some of the things they've done during their time, either as an undergraduate or a graduate student at Auburn. It might be useful to consider for us, especially with so much digital learning still going on. Using a paper-based format, as we said earlier, isn't the only way to go. Using something like Google Sites could be a useful way for students to really showcase their material. It'll also allow more people to access it if that's something that we would like for students to experience. And that is all.